Welcome to the next video lecture for managerial economics. This is a continuation of QandA 9.3. In the other video, I was using Keynote and I went over the actual calculus-based part of the question where we looked at the equilibrium price and quantity for a monopolist given a set of demand and cost functions. And then there was an imposition of a $8 per unit tax, and then we recalculated the new equilibrium price and quantity. Here I'm switching over just because I thought it would be easier to understand if I use this OmniGraph Sketcher application versus doing it in Keynote. So I apologize for the discontinuity of this, but I think you'll understand why this will look a lot better. Hopefully it'll translate to everybody understanding. Given that we were given a demand function that P is equal to 24 minus Q, so that's what we have right here. That's our demand function. Marginal revenue is equal to 24 minus 2Q. So then there we have our marginal revenue, and marginal cost was equal to 2Q. So that was the original situation before the imposition of the tax. And let's just go over some of the things here. This gray area that I've just highlighted is the deadweight loss relative to the output and pricing that would occur in a perfectly competitive marketplace. It was a perfectly competitive marketplace. Output would be set where marginal cost here is equal to demand. So where they intersect one another, and in our instance here it would be equal to 8, that would be the output level, and actually the output level would be 8 and the price would be equal to 16 in a perfectly competitive marketplace. But since this is a monopolist, they restrict output. They set where marginal cost is equal to marginal revenue. So they will set output at a level of 6. So they'll have 6 units per day. And at 6 units per day, what you will end up getting is a price of 18 units. So because of the fact that output is at 6 and not 8, a portion of producer and consumer surplus will be destroyed by the fact that output is restricted. Therefore, this area represents consumer and producer surplus that does not exist under monopoly because of the fact that they restrict output. So make sure you're aware of that. Also, if you remember, let me go with consumer surplus. Consumer surplus is the area above price and below the demand curve. So this yellow area right here is the consumer surplus. So that measures the well-being of consumers in this marketplace. And the green area below that is the producer surplus. It's the area below price but above the supply curve, in this instance marginal cost, and it stops at output of 6 because that's what the monopolist is producing, and that gives us the remaining area, which is the deadweight loss. So what occurred in our example was that there was an imposition of an $8 per unit tax on the monopolist. And what we want to take a look at is how that impacts consumer surplus, how it impacts producer surplus, what happens to deadweight loss, etc. We want to take a look at those implications. So let me bring up this new OmniGraph Sketcher graph, and you'll see here that now we have a new marginal cost curve. That's the new marginal cost curve, and it represents the fact that the imposition of that $8 per unit tax. And you will see that the vertical distance between marginal cost 1 and marginal cost 2 is equivalent to the tax. So marginal cost has shifted upward because if you think of this, if you're this monopolist and the government's going to charge you $8 for every unit of an item that you produce, now you will include that in your cost. So your cost will shift upward, the equivalent of that tax. So if your cost was $2 per unit to produce, your costs are now $8 per unit because now you have to include that $8 tax into your cost functions. So that new marginal cost curve, MC2, reflects the fact that we have an $8 per unit tax. So now our marginal cost is equal to 2Q plus 8. Where under marginal cost 1, it was just equal to 2Q. So now the monopolist is going to adjust their output. They're going to see this new marginal cost curve, and they're going to set output where marginal cost and marginal revenue are equal to one another. So we have, here's our marginal cost, here's our marginal revenue, and where they intersect one another is going to be 4. And then an output of 4, if we go straight up from 4 to the demand curve and across, that gives us a price of 20. So in reaction to the tax, we have the marginal cost curve shifting upward. The monopolist is now going to select the output level where marginal cost 2 intersects the marginal revenue curve. That is equivalent with that. They are equal to one another when Q is equal to 4, and an output of 4, the price associated with that is equal to 20. So what we want to take a look at is what occurs to producer and consumer surplus, and what happens to deadweight loss, etc., when this tax is imposed. Now, if you remember, this area right here that I have highlighted is the original consumer surplus. All right? Well, we know the consumer surplus is going to shrink, and it's going to shrink because of 2 different things. One, output is lower. Originally, output was equal to 6, and now it's equal to 4. So consumers are going to lose out because of the fact that there are 2 units per day that aren't being produced, therefore they're not being consumed, therefore they don't generate consumer surplus. So what I want to do here is let me highlight the area that helps us illustrate, or no, I say helps us illustrate, but actually illustrates the area of deadweight loss for consumer surplus that no longer exists. This triangle right here represents consumer surplus that used to exist prior to the imposition of the tax that no longer exists after the imposition of that tax. All right, so a portion of this original consumer surplus, that highlighted yellow area there, no longer exists. And that is what we call deadweight loss, and that is represented by that triangle right there. Also realize that we know that what? That the area above price and below the demand curve is consumer surplus. So I can highlight the area that is the new consumer surplus. It is the, it is the area here. So remember, here was the original consumer surplus. Here's the new consumer surplus. And how do we account for what used to be consumer surplus? Well, we know that this area here is deadweight loss that doesn't exist anymore. This, and let me highlight it and change the color for you so it's easier to understand. The rectangle below here now becomes producer surplus. Why? Because the price is higher. The price used to be 18, now it's 20. So with a higher price, you're going to generate more producer surplus and less consumer surplus. So let me highlight that. It was lime green. Let's see if that's the right color. It looks like the right color to me. There. All right. So if you take a look at this, if we highlight this, this, and this, there. All of those 3 items, those figures that I've highlighted, used to be consumer surplus. The new consumer surplus is this, and the loss can be accounted for by the fact that a portion has been converted to producer surplus, and a portion of it no longer exists because of deadweight loss. So now we've taken a look and we've shown what the original consumer surplus was. Again, let me highlight that. That's the original consumer surplus. Here's the new consumer surplus. And we've accounted for the difference between the two. This here is converted to producer surplus, and this no longer exists. Therefore, it is deadweight loss. So let's take a look now at what happens on the producer side. Well, we already stated that output is decreasing from 6 to 4. Once there's a decrease in output, we know that consumer surplus is no longer going to exist, or it's going to be destroyed. We can say the same thing for a producer surplus. Remember, the monopolist used to produce 6 units. Now it's only producing 4. There are 2 units of output it is no longer producing. Therefore, it cannot generate producer surplus from that. So because of this, we're going to see some deadweight loss from producer surplus that is being destroyed. So let me highlight that area so you can see that. Oh, didn't change the color like I wanted to. There it is. This is the area of deadweight loss that could be accounted for from the fact that a portion of producer surplus was destroyed. Now, if you take a look at this originally, here was the original area of deadweight loss. The imposition of the tax has now increased the area of deadweight loss to that. So originally, it was the small triangle with the point where marginal cost is equal to the demand curve. And now, with the imposition of the tax, we see that deadweight loss has increased to that triangle and the 3 areas that I've highlighted right there. Now, we haven't finished here because we have not accounted for something else. Remember, a tax was imposed upon the monopolist. Therefore, we have to account for the tax revenue that is being generated from this. All right? So we have not accounted for the taxes that are going to be paid by the monopolist. So the area that accounts for this, and let me pick a different color. I don't know. Let's make it black because the government took it and it ain't there anymore. So let's highlight the area that indicates the tax revenue that is generated. This black area right there is the tax revenue that is generated. So you can see that this had a very significant impact on the marketplace. Originally, deadweight loss was only that triangle there before the imposition of the tax. After the imposition of the tax, the deadweight loss increased in dramatically. Also, remember, what was the consumer surplus? The consumer surplus used to be all 3 of those areas was consumer surplus. After the imposition of the tax, consumer surplus is just that. The areas that were lost, a portion here was converted to producer surplus, and a portion is just deadweight loss. It's consumer surplus that used to exist but no longer exists anymore. Also realize that originally this was the area of producer surplus. All right, this entire area in here that's being highlighted was the producer surplus. What occurred? Well, they gained some producer surplus, right? They gained producer surplus in this area, but what else did they lose? They lost this to deadweight loss, and now they have to pay this out in taxes. So you can see there's quite a dramatic, there's a partially a redistribution of consumer surplus to producer surplus. You can see that there's a dramatic increase in deadweight loss by the imposition of the tax. And you can see that if we highlight the original area, here's the original area of producer surplus. And that shrinks quite a bit because now we have to account for tax revenue and additional deadweight loss. So even though they gained consumer surplus, or consumer surplus was converted to producer surplus, that this also has a dramatic impact on the monopolists. Their producer surplus decreases also. Now, in terms of the burden of the tax, remember what happened. Remember that the tax was $8 per unit. What happened to the price? The price went from $18 per unit to $20 per unit. So the consumers, because of the imposition of the tax, see their price go up by $2. So the $2 divided by the tax, we have 2 divided by 8 is 25%. The burden of the tax is 25% on consumers because that $8 tax on the monopolist caused the price to go up by $2. So they're paying $2 out of the $8 tax that was placed upon the monopolist. And the other amount, the $6 per unit, 6 out of 8, 75%, is being borne by the monopolist.